All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started right now. My name is Coleman Goode. I'm the Manager of Community Organizing here at the AIDS Foundation of Chicago. And thank you for joining us for the HIV Criminalization One-on-One in Illinois. We'll be talking today about HIV-specific laws, HIV-specific criminal laws that are affecting people in Illinois. And we'll be joined by Robert Suttle, who is Assistant Director of the Sero project. We'll also be joined by Scott Schultz, who is the Counsel and HIV Project Manager from Lambda Legal. I'm actually going to start reading a little bit of the instructions on how the webinar is going to go. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Everyone can submit questions at any time using the chat feature. This webinar has too many attendees for questions to be submitted over the phone. During the question and answer segments, the moderators will read selected questions that have been submitted. During this session, you can use this button to raise your hand if you have any questions. If there are more questions than can be answered during the session, the organizer may ask that you type in questions in the question log so that they may be addressed later via email. All right, we're going to get started with Robert Suttle, who is the Assistant Director of the Sero project, and he's going to be talking about free stigma and injustice. Robert, you want to get started?
All right, thank you, Coleman, and hello to you all that are joining this webinar. I'd like to just show my appreciation to the AIDS Foundation of Chicago for considering me to be a part of this, and I couldn't think of also a better person to do this with, Scott Schultz, with Lambda Legal, who I've known for a number of years now. It's how I came to know Scott in this work, so I just appreciate the opportunity to share from a personal perspective about the impact and effects of HIV criminalization. I am a person living with HIV for 15 years this year, and it's been quite an experience of living with HIV. Overall, pretty good. However, I've had my share of some lived experiences, which I'll share here in a moment. But I am an Assistant Director of the Sero project, which is a national network of people living with HIV and allies known for its reform work to end inappropriate criminal prosecutions of people with HIV. Our work mainly includes raising public awareness through national, statewide, and local community education efforts, like this, for example, being on webinars and conferences and things like that. My role at Sero is to oversee community outreach and education, something I don't mind doing and always sharing to inform people about things they don't know, and to also coordinate Sero's HIV Criminalization Survivors Network, provide through support and engagement with those who have been prosecuted or at greatest risk of prosecution. This work is important to me. You might ask, why do you even care about this work? It's specifically because my life was nearly destroyed by a grossly unjust HIV prosecution and conviction starting back in, actually started in 2008, but I was convicted in 2009. And so if you do the math, it's been almost 9 years now this past end of June when I was convicted in 2009. And so it's almost 10 years and I'm still here, and I'm glad that I'm able to take this opportunity to share and give some insight on what this is, which you'll learn more about as it relates to the state of Illinois. So instead of retreating, I just decided to embrace this work with a passion and clear-eyed conviction, with an understanding that our level of awareness determines our destiny. And I am not afraid to admit that I didn't know much about anything, let alone HIV. I didn't even know that I was at risk. As a Black gay man growing up in the South, I just didn't know. And I'm sure there are many that did not know, and many young people today that don't know as well. Which is why it's important that we continue to do these type of things, webinars and community forums and any type of educational sessions that we can to inform people about this, and particularly the Black community, because the impact and how disproportionately impacted we are by HIV as well as the criminal justice system. So I just wanted to just share some of what the consequences of an unjust HIV criminalization prosecution is. For those of you that may not know, these are outdated laws that were passed in the 80s, late 80s and early 90s. I was 1 year old when these nearly 1 to 2, 3 years old when these laws were introduced. So what's unfortunate about it is that these laws define people as an inherent danger to society for non-disclosure, for having sex or exposing someone. People who must be regulated, controlled, prosecuted, and imprisoned, therefore creating a bar on the class and the law. I mean, I did not know these things about HIV, let alone around the impact of the laws and the criminalization of it, and to be characterized in such a way as if I'm a danger to society, which is not where I really consider myself, but because it's something that I have that exists within me, this is how society characterizes it. And I simply see this as another way to incarcerate already marginalized and vulnerable communities, particularly people of color, Black people. For histories, we've had disproportionate impact, been impacted by HIV, and as well as the criminal justice system, and what greater manifestation of stigma than to have it enshrined in the law, which is what these HIV criminalization statutes represent. And I didn't know that it's a lesser known felony charge when I was being prosecuted. And not many people, I think, are aware of that. They also give long prison sentences, anywhere from 10, 25, 30 plus years. And in the state of Louisiana, which is where I was prosecuted, I was looking at 10 years. But there have been other people in Iowa who were, Nick Rose, who was facing 25 years. And there was Michael Johnson in Missouri, who was facing 30 plus years for two sort of sentences run concurrently, but now he's down to 10. And you can read about Michael Johnson by Googling his name and learning about his case. And then there's Terry Thomas, who's in Idaho, who's facing a 30 plus year. He won't be out of prison until 2038. So that's another 20 years from now. So those are just some examples, and there are more here that I will share around the consequences of an unjust HIV criminalization prosecution. Others are, it can be used as an abusive tool in relationships, and even with an encounter with law enforcement over the threat of prosecution. So it's not always tied to sex or a sexual situation that arises out of sex, but just existing as a person living with HIV. If you get in a fight with someone, or just an encounter again with law enforcement from something as being simply pulled over for whatever, it's just that easy. So as a result of this experience, I've experienced embarrassment at the workplace. I was arrested at work when I was facing prosecution. And what's so ironic about it is that I was working at a court, state court of appeal for the state of Louisiana, and they definitely came there to arrest me. And therefore, I ultimately lost my job as a result of the indictment of that charge. The impact on employment is real. There are other people who couldn't go back to their jobs for many reasons, because one, if they got arrested, and two, if they were definitely convicted, they definitely could not go back to their jobs. So that's that, and you definitely need a job in order to survive in this country, in this world. Other issues are outing your HIV status to your family and community, which is definitely what happened to me. I wasn't estranged from my family and my friends, thank God, but they didn't know about my HIV status because I held that closely to myself, and I did what I needed to do in terms of being responsible, making sure I went to my doctor's appointments and be on my treatment. But unfortunately, because of the criminalization experience, it revealed more than what I personally wanted to reveal to my own family. But of course, they know that about that now. But for others, outing their HIV status can sometimes lead to partner violence and people being kicked out of their homes simply because of their HIV status, not because they posed a risk to anybody, but just because they're living with HIV, which is problematic. Demonization in the media. I'm sure many of you have seen some hysterical and stigmatizing headlines, that really don't make sense when you read the article. And a lot of times those stories are not very accurate in terms of describing the situation. And usually they characterize the person living with HIV as the predator. but we never know about anything about actual transmission occurred or anything. So it's very unfortunate that a place where people get most of their news, that a lot of times people living with HIV are characterized or demonized even in the media. Some other heavy hitters here: mandated sex offender registration, which was something that I definitely did not expect when I went to report to the probation officer at that time. In the state of Louisiana, and there are other states, maybe 5 or 6 states in the country that require sex offender registration. In Louisiana, for example, and I think even Oklahoma, it requires you to have your photo on your driver's license, even ID, sex offender on the bottom in big red letters. So if you imagine looking at your driver's license and having to show that to the bank or to your health, go to your doctor's office or anything, just imagine what people would think about that. And other impacts of that is I had to take out an ad in the city paper. I had to pay for it myself, stating that I was a sex offender and also what the conviction was. In the state of Louisiana, the statute is entitled intentional exposure to the AIDS virus. So it's very broad and leaves people to all sorts of thoughts and imaginations about what one would have or may have done or allegedly have done to have that type of conviction. And also there are postcards that when you're a registered sex offender, you have to send postcards within a certain mile radius within your community. So that's to a church, to a school, to area businesses, stores, that these people will see your photo again and see what your conviction was. And also it's outing your HIV status and disclosing something that you probably wouldn't normally tell a neighbor or people at the church or whomever. And so for me personally, the sex offender registration stigma, of course, followed me from Louisiana to Pennsylvania and even here to New York. And for example, in Pennsylvania, I had to, the police chief went around with flyers with my picture on there. And again, with the information about my conviction, putting everyone on notice about the fact that I was a registered sex offender living in the community. And then other restrictions are for some people where if you are a mother, we have a survivor named Tiffany who's having to register sex offender in the state of Tennessee. She has a child, and there were problems where she couldn't take her child to school or to parks, or which is kind of outrageous. But this stuff just goes very deep from state to state, so it's different experiences. But yet the stigmatization of it all is something that we all can relate to. Financial ruin, loss of medical benefits, you can lose your home, and even for someone who's also surviving the military, he lost his pension, 26 years in the military, and he lost everything because he was convicted under the Uniform Code of Military Justice as it related to his HIV status. Some other issues of mental health challenges that can lead to addiction, depression, anxiety, sleepless nights and days, and sense of thinking that you can't do something about your future. And for some of the survivors, it's even led to suicide. They've had suicidal tendencies or attempts at ending their own lives. So this goes beyond just, someone being accused. If you accused and convicted, and even if some instances you're not convicted, once this is out there, once the accusation is out there, whether it's in the media or whatever, it's out there. You can't take it back. So it's something that people need to really take seriously and think twice about before deciding to press charges and to understanding whether they are really at risk or not. And some other issues around travel challenges and restrictions, just being able to go in and out of the country, and if so, being detained by customs for hours. They don't say anything to you. They don't tell you why you're being asked to come to the back. You can assume, right, from having a felony or whatever conviction, but they don't say anything to you. They just tell you where to go. You sit there and you just wait and wait and wait. And this is every time you go in and out of the country. And I've even attempted to try to go to Mexico one time for a vacation, and I couldn't. They deported me back to the States within hours of landing there. And so, so the collateral consequences go very far, and they follow you even after you've done your time, whether it's in prison or even if you've been on probation or whatever. They continue to follow you almost pretty much for the rest of your life. And so I'm still continuing to live out those collateral consequences, despite, you know, my advocacy around this. But it is something I'm compelled to do, to share with people, to let them understand and let them know what people have to go through, that it's not more than just what you see on TV or in the media. These things have long-lasting consequences. And the thing that I want to point out here, in Louisiana, they consider it a sex crime, a crime of violence, which I just don't quite understand, because with the advancements in treatment and science today, people are living longer, healthier lives and not necessarily transmitting HIV, especially if you are in care, whether you have an undetectable viral load or not. I think all of those things are great things, but unfortunately, many people are not aware of their HIV status, and they need to be. And I don't think transmissions are just going to stop because you create laws. I don't think they've been that productive to do that. And overall, calling this a sex crime or crime of violence, it's really, and all these things that I've listed here, it's just a systemic cruelty inflicted on people living with HIV. That's really what this is. And it's based out of fear and ignorance, and all the other isms that exist in society. So I'm going to close by just talking about the HIV is not a crime, the movement, and why you're on this call. And I hope that you are inspired and encouraged to get involved there in the state of Illinois. So in the context of organizing around HIV criminalization, I believe this movement compels us to use an intersectional lens and reminds us of the importance of centering the voices and leadership of people living with HIV, as well as other communities disproportionately impacted by criminalization in all its form. HIV criminalization is just a piece of the pie of the mass incarceration pie, or the prison industrial complex. And if you're not familiar with these terms, I encourage you to learn about them. It'll definitely help you see this in a much bigger way. And one of Sero's strategies is to build networks with people living with HIV in a number of states. And you can also include these as coalitions, people living with HIV definitely being involved in coalition building along with other allies. And we find that with networks and coalitions, there are persuasive and powerful advocacy tools that have led to the growth of organizing around HIV criminalization reform in many states. And definitely Scott Chavez will be able to explain to you some of the things that he's been involved in as well. So I am grateful that Illinois is looking to organize and build a coalition there to go further with improving their statute there. And I'm grateful for the time that I've been allowed to share with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. That was really great. Indeed, thank you for sharing your personal story with us. I really love the part that you talked about the intersectionality and talk about mass incarceration, because that is a part that people really don't understand, and they forget about, that this is more than just the HIV crime laws. This is a bigger picture of harming people that are marginalized. So thank you for talking about that. I think now we're going to move on to Scott, who's going to talk a little bit more about the specific laws here in Illinois. Scott?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Coleman. Really appreciate it. And really appreciate Robert's comments. It's always great to present with Robert, and this opportunity, as Robert had said, to present to some folks. And my understanding is we have quite a few people on the call, so very excited about that. Always happy to bring information about this subject to a wider audience, because I think it is, as of yet, still an known and an under-addressed problem. So my presentation is going to talk about this issue more broadly, kind of walk you through how some of these laws actually work in practice, some of the effects of these laws and why they really are detrimental, not just to people living with HIV, but really to all of us, and to people at higher risk for HIV, to our communities, etc. And we'll finish off focusing a little bit more specifically on Illinois and what's happening here. So next slide, please. I should probably do this first. So my name, as Coleman told you, is Scott Shottis. I am the HIV Project Director at Lambda Legal. I'm also a person who lives openly with HIV. And so, this work, as all of my work as the HIV Project Director there, is important to me and has a real resonance. So first I wanted to tell you a little bit about Lambda Legal. If you're not familiar, Lambda Legal is a national organization committed to achieving the full recognition of the civil rights of lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, transgender people, and people living with HIV through impact litigation, education, and public policy work. So, and the first thing there that's listed is impact litigation. I think that's our bread and butter and what we're known best for. And what that means is that we bring cases in court that are usually representing the interests of one or two people or a group of people, but really they're designed to have a broader impact that's not just an outcome for those individuals, but a broader impact on the issue for the whole community, for whatever constituency is being served by that case. So that's what that's about, education and public policy work. This is an example of the kind of education that we engage in. And then the public policy work really is the HIV criminalization work is in that arena. And it's about creating change through changing laws and policies that we think are detrimental to the constituencies we serve. I also want to just point out that people living with HIV specifically is in our mission statement, and that's important. Lambda Legal has been in this fight since the beginning. I'll talk about that in a second on the next slide, but and it's not just sort of an adjunct to what we do for the LGBT community, but it is a core part of our work. And it has been for the entire time that the epidemic has been going on in this country. Next slide, please. On that front, we brought the first HIV discrimination lawsuit in 1983 in New York City when we successfully prevented a co-op there from evicting a doctor who was simply treating people living with HIV. This co-op got it in their heads that they did not want these sick-looking individuals in the lobby of their co-op building, which is where this doctor's office was, and so we're trying to evict him. I think it's a bit ironic that they had a doctor's office in their building, but did not want sick people to be in the building. Obviously, that is a representation and a demonstration of the stigma and discrimination that has always surrounded this medical condition and has created a lot of the problems that we've been addressing ever since in various areas, including privacy and confidentiality, employment, foster care and adoption, parenting, healthcare, housing, public accommodations, etc. Next slide, please. So that's who we are. I'm going to just talk a little bit here about what's been happening out there. You just heard Robert's story, so you have some idea of what is happening. You heard what happened to him, but we're seeing things like a 10-year sentence for a Georgia woman alleged not to have disclosed her HIV status, a 25-year sentence in Iowa, as Robert also mentioned, for a person after a one-time encounter involving protected sex. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Because we actually ended up representing that individual, and then some change happened in Iowa that was pretty good. But and then there's a 35-year sentence that a man is serving in Texas who spit at a police officer while living with HIV. And we all on this call, I hope, know that spitting is not a way that HIV is even possible to transmit HIV, and yet this person is serving this just a horrific sentence based on that conduct. So that's an idea of the range of things that are happening. Next slide, please. And I think these are some useful questions just to keep in mind as we go through this for us all to be thinking about. So what is it that drives these prosecutions and extremely harsh sentences? What are the aims of these laws, and are they advancing those aims? Are they advancing those goals? Are these laws fairly distributing the obligations, burdens, benefits, and responsibility for maintaining sexual health? Obviously, those things are important, and we want to achieve those things. We want there to be sexual health, but is this a fair way to distribute those things between the parties involved? And then, is this an appropriate context for regulation by the state? I think maybe we've telegraphed that a little bit in talking about the problems of mass incarceration and state involvement in a number of issues, but in particular in this context of intimate sexual relationships. Is that appropriate context for regulation by the state? And if so, is the criminal law the right tool to be using in this context? So all things to be thinking about as we talk through this. Next slide, please. And maybe we'll circle back to at the end and can talk about more. So as I said, this presentation, I'm going to describe the landscape of HIV criminalization in the United States, explain why HIV criminalization is doing more harm than good, and then discuss what is being done and what can be done to fix the problem with a focus on us here in Illinois. Next slide, please. And forgive me if I speak too fast, but I've got a lot of information I want to share, and I'm just going to keep zipping along. Hopefully everyone's following, and you can ask questions at the end. So what does an HIV-specific statute look like? I use Florida as an example just because, I don't know, it's a representative statute. I also happen to be doing some work down there as well right now. But in Florida, it is a felony punishable by up to 5 years in prison and or a $5,000 fine if an HIV positive person knows that he or she is HIV positive, has been informed that HIV may be transmitted during sexual intercourse, and then has sexual intercourse with any other person without disclosing his or her status. So I just kind of want to walk through this quickly. Oh, and it's possible, and this has been happening, for people to be charged with multiple counts based on the same relationship. So, you could be in a relationship with someone and have had sex 6 times, and they potentially would charge you with 6 counts, which would then result in a 30-year potential sentence. But I want to walk through this. The first one, you know that you're HIV positive. Well, we want that one, right? That's an actual, there's nothing wrong with that. That's what we want to have happen. The second one, we want people to know that it may be transmitted during sexual intercourse. So that's the second element, is something we actually want. So really all comes down to this third one, is that if you're an HIV positive person and you have sexual intercourse without disclosing your status, but I want to throw out there that the question is, well, how do you prove that? How do you prove that you disclosed your status? In these situations, we are almost always talking about a he said, she said, or he said, situation. And unless you've whipped out the contract before having sexual intercourse, it's going to be hard to show that you disclosed your status. So really, it's about having sexual intercourse as an HIV positive person without the ability to prove that you disclosed your status. And that's all it takes to be convicted under one of these statutes. So that is that's an example of what a statute looks like. Next slide, please. So this, before I go on to this, I should also say that it is not just states with an HIV-specific statute like what I just showed you, but there's also a problem in states that use the general criminal law. So not all states have an HIV-specific criminal law, but a bunch of states still use other general criminal laws like reckless endangerment, assault with a deadly weapon, attempted murder, to engage in prosecutions that are based on the same conduct. So when you add all those states together, as you can see on this map, both the ones that have HIV-specific laws and then the ones who have or use general criminal laws to prosecute people living with HIV for having sex and not being able to prove disclosure, this is the states that are affected. It's a lot of states. And even on this map, we still include, or still included, are states like Iowa, which still has a law that that criminalizes this conduct, even though reform has happened there. Similarly, California's on this, although in the California, we'll talk more about this, in California and the change that happened there, HIV is no longer singled out, and it really is applying to all infectious diseases. We'll talk more about that when we get there. But as you can see from this map, this is not a problem that's just happening in the South. It's not a problem that's just happening in, in Illinois. It is a very widespread phenomenon, and basically anything that has a color here that is that orange, dark orange, or that lighter orange is a state where we still have a problem. Next slide, please. This is a slightly different map, and it goes back to 2010 and 2013. It was an attempt to identify all of the prosecutions that had taken place and then where some of the hot spots were. You'll see the states that have that little exclamation point in a triangle are states that have been particularly problematic in the number of prosecutions that have been brought. There's states where there have been 5 or more, or there were 5 or more prosecutions during this time period. I will caveat this with, CHLP, the Center for HIV Law and Policy, is the source for this, and they have been doing an amazing job of collecting information about these prosecutions, but even their efforts are hindered by the fact that we don't keep good statistics on this. Some of this is anecdotal. Not all of these things are reported. Not all of them are collected through the state criminal statistic collection mechanisms. So this is probably an under count or an underestimation of the number of prosecutions in places. So keep that in mind. But this is a map that sort of shows the same thing. Next slide, please. So why this is sort of the heart of this presentation, which is why these laws, explaining why these laws are doing more harm than good. And I break it down into 3 broad categories, and then I have 5 sort of bullet points under each of these. But the 3 broad categories are that these laws are contrary to public health goals. They raise due process issues, in other words, issues of fairness and for people who are accused under them. And they are inflicting serious individual and group harms on people living with HIV, and as Robert said, in particular, people living with HIV who also are within other marginalized communities or groups. So next slide. So I'm going to break down each of these, and so they all come up at once here. Try not to read ahead. But the first one is that these laws can be, under the public health setting, that these laws can be a disincentive to HIV testing. So as you saw on the statute that I showed you, the first thing is that you have to know that you have HIV. So if someone was reading that law and thought that it was possible that they have HIV and were afraid of what that might mean in terms of their being pursued by the criminal justice system, they might choose not to test for HIV, so that they could not be prosecuted under this law. We don't have great evidence, scientific evidence of this phenomenon, but we do have a lot of anecdotal evidence, and there is some indication that, for instance, testing rates went down in a Canadian city after a very well publicized HIV criminalization prosecution. So there is some correlative connection there, but still working on the science of this. But I mean, I think it's intuitive, and people kind of understand that this is something that could happen. This next one that it may actually encourage non-disclosure is a little counterintuitive, but if you think about if you're a person living with HIV and you've ended up hooking up with someone, and you did not disclose before that first encounter, for whatever reason, and there are lots of good reasons, which we'll get to, why a person living with HIV might choose not to disclose, well, now you're never going to disclose it to that person. Because now if you disclose it to that person, you are essentially telling them that they can go to the police and have you prosecuted and thrown in jail. So you're handing them the keys to your prison cell if you now disclose any time after that first encounter. And we see, you know, I know this is going to come as a shock to people, but relationships go sour. And so while you're in the relationship, it may not be a problem, but then when there's a breakup, suddenly that person is going and saying, well, yeah, he told me later, but he didn't tell me until, you know, after the first encounter, or a week in, or a month in. And we see this happen all the time. Prosecutions are started after a nasty breakup. So it can actually encourage non-disclosure. These laws can alienate patients from healthcare providers. So unfortunately, what happens oftentimes is the healthcare provider is brought in to the criminal, into court, to testify and say, yeah, I told this person knew he was HIV positive. I tested this person. They have been informed of how HIV is transmitted, that it can be transmitted sexually, as you saw in the Florida statute. That's an element of the crime, that the person has been informed. So they rely upon people's healthcare providers or the people that tested them to provide that information in court. And that's just a horrible dynamic to suddenly have your doctor or someone with whom that you trusted now being compelled. And it doesn't have to be that that person wants to harm you, but they're being compelled to testify against you. So pretty horrific. And obviously we want people living with HIV or any condition to be able to talk to their doctors about their risk behaviors and be honest. And if you create a situation where there's not trust in that relationship, well, then you're going to shut down those communications and the opportunity to modify them, both for the health of that person and the health of others. And so really bad. There's no evidence that these laws actually deter the behavior that they're trying to deter, which is, I guess, unprotected sex without disclosure. Just no evidence that they're actually working to do that. And they send an inaccurate message regarding prevention responsibility. So they really make it about the person living with HIV, and there's no requirement that the other person ask, or that they've taken any responsibility, or that they just should be responsible for the risks that they've chosen to engage in. You know, the fact is that yes, a person living with HIV could tell you that they have HIV, but what you probably need to be more worried about is the person who doesn't have HIV, or doesn't think they have HIV, but because they tested negative, I don't know, 2 months ago, but they've been having sex with people since then without a condom, and they are much more likely to be too infectious than someone who is living with HIV and in treatment. So it's a messed up message that is sent around who's responsible, and it places all the responsibility really on the person living with HIV. Next slide, please. This second set of issues is about due process and about fairness, really, in court and in other ways. So the intent requirement in these laws has disappeared, or it was never put there in the first place. The original idea and the original mandate from the Ryan White program, in order to get funds from Ryan White, there was something put in there that said states had to be able to prosecute the intentional transmission of HIV. But for whatever reason, you know, some states had actually started enacting these laws before that was in Ryan White. So the laws started ending up on the books that there was no intent requirement. You don't have to have the intent to transmit HIV. It doesn't have to be an intentional act at all. It really is almost a strict liability crime at this point. You're HIV positive, you have sex, and you can't prove disclosure, and you are guilty. So that has disappeared. As we've already been talking about, extremely difficult to prove disclosure, right? Unless you're gonna, you know, have somebody sign something or record them saying that you disclosed your HIV status, it is hard to prove. I will say on this front that there are some ameliorative measures, and we do encourage people now to when if they're going to disclose, to put it in a text message and save those text messages with the person's response acknowledging that, because that potentially could be used to get you out of one of these prosecutions. But overall, right, we just know that that's not going to happen every time. And there's not going to be, there's not going to be disclosure in some instances. And in some instances where there's no real risk of transmission. As Robert alluded to, Nick Rhodes was someone who had a one-time encounter with someone he met online late at night, goes over to this guy's place. They have oral sex without a condom, but they have anal sex with a condom. Nick had an undetectable viral load, which I think we all know at this point means that there is effectively no risk of transmission from a person with an undetectable viral load. And yet the person later found out that Nick was HIV positive, freaked out, went to get PEP, was denied PEP by one hospital, went to a different hospital who provided post-exposure prophylaxis. I think the first hospital told him he had not actually engaged in any conduct that put him at any significant risk, even without knowing the undetectable part. And but anyhow, they provided him with PEP, and they told him, do you know it's illegal in this? You could have him prosecuted if he did not tell you his HIV status. That's illegal in Iowa. This gentleman went, filed a complaint with the police. Nick was arrested, thrown in jail, dragged out of his place of employment, and eventually ended up pleading guilty on some poor advice of counsel. Thought that he would, the judge would see that this was no big deal. HIV had not been transmitted. There was no real risk, etc. And thought the judge would be lenient. And Nick ended up sentenced initially to a 25-year term for engaging in this conduct that presented really no risk of transmission. So I'll talk more about what happened with Nick, but for a while he was under this 25-year sentence. Next point I have here is juror moral disapproval and disconnect from other subcultures. This is just about, I think that for some jurors, for some members of the public, they don't understand hookup culture. They don't understand what happens, on websites. They just, and I'm not even talking about necessarily just in the gay community with respect to hookup culture. I'm talking more broadly. But then they also have a disconnect around gay people. And this really became a big issue in the Michael Johnson case that Robert referred to, with a jury that just did not, was shown pictures of, sexual conduct that had been recorded by Michael Johnson. They were talking about gay sex, and that, in addition to some of the racial demagoguery that was done by the prosecutors in that case, really tainted the outcome and the sentence that was imposed. So it's just really bad idea to put these kinds of relationships into the hands of a group of 12 people who have no understanding of the culture from which they arise. The scientific details are frequently ignored. So, even if a statute says that there has to be transmission from one person to another, they're not actually proving that in most cases. There's science out there that can be used to at least disprove that, and that is never brought in. Most of these statutes talk about if there could be transmission, which is a very broad standard, and the fact that, for instance, being on treatment really makes it next to impossible to transmit HIV. Those things are not reflected in the statute. So the scientific details of this are ignored, and as we've seen, they result in disproportionate crazy sentences. So I'll go back to Nick and just say, eventually a group of, there was a campaign that was started to talk to this judge, to convince this judge that this sentence was really severe and needed to be looked at. Nick had spent about a year and a quarter in jail before this happened, but eventually the judge did suspend his sentence, and he was on probation for 5 years. Two things I'll say about that. First, I wonder if, so Nick is a white man, I wonder if Nick had been a person of color, if the judge would have been as likely to do that and to suspend the sentence. And I will say, he said something, it's in the transcript, about how, Nick didn't look like most people who come through his courtroom. So some coded or not so coded language that was about race. And it demonstrates, how race permeates this and all of the criminal justice system. But then secondly, I will say Nick was put on probation, but there were all these restrictions around probation, and he was still a convicted felon, and he then had to register as a sex offender. And so, and Robert went through some of the things around that. I mean, there were crazy things with Nick in terms of him not being able to spend time around his niece and nephew, even though this was a conduct that was between two consenting adults, had nothing to do with children. Nick was tested that something was actually, a device was attached to his penis to measure arousal, and he was shown pictures of children and sex acts, and I mean, just really disturbing stuff that happens once you're on a sex offender registry, and that is part of the punishment in a lot of these cases. Next slide, please. So, inflicting serious individual and group harms. Oh, this one is maybe not as intuitive, may result in secondary disclosure. And I said I would talk about some of the reasons that a person living with HIV might not want to disclose their status. So, unfortunately, once you've disclosed your status to this person, by the way, not who you've had sex with, not who is your partner, not who is your girlfriend, boyfriend, or whatever, but someone that you're just considering having sex with you, there's nothing that prevents that person from sharing that information with others. Now, there is a law in Illinois that arguably could be used, but it hasn't really been tested in the courts that much, for good reason, and we want to sort of preserve the ability to claim that this law prevents secondary disclosure like that, but not a lot of protection, not a lot of remedy if somebody goes and discloses your status now to other people. So that's problematic. It can be used, the laws can be used as a coercive tool by HIV negative partner. And this, we've heard a lot of anecdotal accounts of, especially in relationships where there's a power differential, where it's some type of abusive relationship, that one person, the HIV negative person, basically says, well, I know you told me your status, but if you leave me, if you don't do X, Y, or Z, if you do X, Y, or Z, I'm going to go to the police and tell them that you didn't disclose. And so, it's really putting this very powerful tool and more like a weapon in the hands of an HIV negative abusive partner. Obviously, as Robert described, it can ruin individual lives. And people like Robert are resilient, and other people that have been prosecuted under these laws are resilient, and we celebrate their resiliency, but they shouldn't have to demonstrate their resiliency in this way. And some other people, struggle more with coming back from a conviction under one of these laws. And someone like Carrie Thomas has spent years and years in jail and has years and years ahead of him. So really ruining the individual lives of people living with HIV. These laws oppress other already marginalized populations. So there are real devastating consequences on sex workers. And some of the laws, like the ones in California, actually target sex workers specifically, make it easier to convict sex workers living with HIV. The laws are sometimes used against undocumented individuals in immigration proceedings. So we actually defended someone who had been convicted under the sex worker provision in California, but we didn't defend them directly. We supported their case. But their conviction under that provision was then being used in immigration court to say that they had engaged in a particularly serious crime, which was grounds for deportation. And this was somebody who who was picked up in a sting operation by an undercover police officer. So he hadn't engaged in any conduct that could possibly transmit HIV, and the conduct in which they were supposed to engage was going to be oral sex, which, the risk is very, very low and maybe non-existent. And yet here it was going to result potentially in his deportation. And then finally, they stigmatize all people living with HIV. And I think Robert talked a little bit about this, right? The accounts that we see, and really the way that we see most people living with HIV in the news these days is as a result of one of these prosecutions. And they're depicted as a predator and an AIDS monster, and often used to demagogue about prevention and to get people to come in and test. This is all before a conviction even happens. That person's picture and name are splashed up on TV screens, and people are told that they have HIV, and often told if you had sex with anyone, if you've had sex with this person or anyone who has had sex with this person, you need to come in and get tested. And that's how they drum up more counts potentially against the person. But it paints a picture of people living with HIV that is not at all accurate and really harmful to us. So next slide, please. And I know I'm coming in on the close here, so I'm going to sort of run through the end quickly so we have a little bit of time for questions. Next slide, please. Those on that side, you see all of the harms listed, and there is a, next slide. This is on our website. If you go to lambdalegal.org and search for 15 ways HIV criminalization harms us all, you will find this document. Am I on my last slide? Next slide. Well, and there it is. There's the document itself, 15 ways HIV criminalization harms us all. You can find it on our website. Next slide, please. So I was going to revisit the questions, and maybe we can do this in, if people have questions here at the end, but I just wanted to bring these back up because I think that we've answered some of these questions, I hope, through the presentation, but good for us to continue thinking about. Next slide, please. What is being done, what can be done, and what can you do? So I think we want to talk a little bit about what's happening here in Illinois, and we do have a coalition forming around this issue, looking to address the problem, whether that is through public education campaign, educating legislators around this, and then eventually potentially bringing a bill to try and change the law. So next slide, please. So being involved in some of that would be a great way for you to be involved. There are efforts going on at an international level, at a national level, and then like this at a state and local level. We've had success in places. Well, first of all, the UN is pretty good on this issue and is behind us. And then there's a group called HIV Justice Worldwide, I believe, that focuses on the international piece. At the national level, DOJ has issued good things, really great guidelines for reforming these laws. We've got groups like the National Alliance of State and Territorial AIDS Directors and even the CDC and others all have coalesced around this issue. And then we've had success in various states, and there are efforts going on in a lot of states. The successes we've had have been in Iowa, in California, in Colorado, and then a sort of partial victory in North Carolina. So these things are happening, and they're moving in a bunch of other states, including Illinois. Next slide, please. I kind of talked about this, so let's go to the next slide. I'm hoping to get to my slides about Illinois if I have them. Let's keep going. Next slide. So here's the Illinois law. And I'm going to just tell you about this quickly because I think that's sort of where we're headed next. So this law was actually changed a few years ago, like maybe 6 years ago now. This law was changed, and it was made better. This was the old law, pre-2012, and it was like other laws. Basically said if you engage in intimate contact while living with HIV, that you could be convicted. Next slide, please. It was changed so that, next slide. It was changed, oh no, sorry, this is still my old slides. Next slide. Those are really what the elements are, which make it like the other ones. Next slide, please. And it was changed so that now you have to, the only sexual activity that is addressed is vaginal or anal intercourse. So oral sex is no longer a part of the law. So that's a good part. If you do not, you have to not use a condom to be convicted. So that is good. It says here you have to have the specific intent to commit the offense. And that's sort of been the bugaboo is, well, what does that mean? We think it means you have to have the specific intent to transmit HIV because the name of the crime is criminal transmission of HIV. And we have other good legal arguments as to why that means intent to transmit. but prosecutors don't seem to get that, and we've been in arguments with them about that. So that's one of the reasons we may go back in to change the law, is to clarify that for prosecutors. Next slide, please. And so, yeah, these are the elements of the new law. It's still problematic, especially if we can't get that intent piece to be made clear. But still, it's true that no transmission is required, and that's something we'd like to see changed. And we'd like to just make it easier to show that you engaged in protected conduct, which should include things like being on treatment. Next slide, please. So that's it. I almost sort of got it done in time. We'll open it up, I think, for questions for a little bit. There is this effort that's coalescing in Illinois. I think Coleman will tell us more about how we can be involved in that, and I'll take any questions that people might have.
All right, thank you, Scott. That was a lot of information. Really appreciate it. I think we do have a question here.
Great.
I think the question is, am I to assume that even if scientifically based is presented to the DA, they can still have the discretion to charge the individual? That's by Christian.
Yeah, so we are having some success in some jurisdictions, and in particular in Cook County, and this is recently, going to prosecutors and showing them the scientific evidence that a person with an undetectable viral load, or really a suppressed viral load, is unable to transmit HIV, and we have been successful in getting a prosecution or two dropped in that way. And we are working on a commitment from higher up in the office, from Kimberly Fox, that they will stop prosecuting people who have an undetectable viral load.
Yeah.
Of course, that's not a comprehensive solution, but it at least, you know, we're starting to get that information into the right hands to prevent them in some cases not having the same kind of success in other counties. And so you have to keep that in mind.
We also have another question. Just to clarify, the Illinois Coalition hasn't decided whether we are pursuing modernization or repeal. Yes. Yes, we have not decided yet.
That is correct. And so that's why I said that it's really, we're coalescing right now, and we are trying to figure out, I mean, I said, you know, it may just be an education campaign. It could end up with a bill to modify the law. It could end up with a bill to repeal the law. We're looking at all those options. And I'll just share, because I think it's important. I have reservations about repealing the law that I just want to explain to people. I'm afraid that if we repeal the law, we make Illinois like the states where prosecutions occur without an HIV-specific criminal law. And the prosecutions can be just as virulent, just as sort of severe, and it's just harder to fight sometimes when there's no parameters or guidelines around what a successful prosecution would look like. And so I see some benefit to having keeping an HIV-specific law, but really putting a bunch of hurdles into it that make it impossible, all but impossible, if not impossible, to actually prosecute.
Great. I don't. Sorry?
I said, but it's still being decided, you know, and that's my viewpoint, and there's different viewpoints in the coalition, and this is one of the things that we need to figure out, and we need your help to figure out.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys for joining. Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Scott, for all the information and providing today. If anyone has any questions about the coalition that we're forming, or any questions about HIV criminalization, you can contact me at cgoode@aidschicago.org, and I would be happy to answer those questions or provide any answers you need. Again, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Coleman. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.